landmines. Even now, on average, 20,000 civilians are injured per year. Some are deaths, but the injury death combined is about 20,000. As I mentioned, about 60 countries for sure have landmines. So the lower estimates are 55. The United Nations claims it was 64. And the International Campaign to Ban Landmines claims the number is more near 90. And ICBL, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, got a Nobel Prize for their work some time ago, Nobel Peace Prize. A little bit of the economics. Landmines are very cheap to make. Typically, they cost less than $1, a little over $1 to make. They are plastic containers, okay? Pretty much like a normal plastic container, flat. I have a few. I don't have it on me because they're in my office. As you can tell from the background, I'm at home. And they are filled with explosives inside. And then they have a tiny metal fuse on the top. And then they have a rubber lid. So what happens is that suppose somebody steps on a mine or steps on the soil above a mine, the rubber lid gets compressed, touches the explosives and the metal fuse, and nothing happens then, but as that person releases the foot pressure, the mine goes off. And the amount of pressure difference is not too small, but it's not too large. So a child's foot being released is enough to let a mine get a mine going. So economics of it, $1,000 on average, if you do the numbers, is the cost to remove each mine on average. I'll break it down for you later. And globally, the budget is about 100 million mines, $100 million, all countries combined. Most poor countries can't spend more than even a couple of million a year for mine clearance. US spends about 160 million over a 3-year period, about 55 million per year on mine clearance. US doesn't have mines. US uses that money for mine clearance help in other countries. But that's done by US military. And about 50 million for R&D, which is, 50 million sounds like a big number, but 50 million is an extremely small number for any kind of serious research like that. The long and short of it is that these numbers should be interpreted as basically no money is spent on landmine removal related research, detection related research globally, almost no money. This money is at least 100 to 1,000 times less than what is minimally needed to meet the criterion for removing mines. So here are pictures of some mines. The mine that I have is the one that you see in the bottom. It's a Russian mine. It's called a PMN2 mine. The one above is also another standard mine. I don't have one of those. Just to give you a story of how the world has changed. When I started working on landmines, I asked a scientist at the US Army to get me a few landmines. And he said, oh, no problem. They'll be in your mailbox in a few days. I said, are you kidding me? They said, no. Don't worry about it. I'm serious. I'll send you a few in mail. The year was 2000. And sure enough, after 2 days, I walked into the mail room in the physics department at UB where I work. And there was a big clumsy envelope kind of shoved in my mailbox, which is not a small mailbox. And there was an anti-tank mine about this wide, about a foot in diameter, about maybe 4 to 5 inches in height. Overall height about 5.5 inches or so. Large anti-tank mine. And then there was this anti-personnel mine, which is meant to not hurt tanks, but hurt people. And this rubber mine, this PMN2 mine here, that's what I got. In those days, you could send it by mail. Army sent it to me by mail. Of course, then 9/11 happened. Everything changed. All right. So anyway, I told you that I was interested in seeing if the ground can be essentially tapped to see if one could find landmines. And I wanted to find out what was going on. And that led me to a journey that was quite fascinating. And I'll tell you very briefly the story. So the answer is yes, you can tap the soil if you know what you're doing. And you can pretty much find what's there in the soil. So while we were doing this research, in 1998, I had the chance to present our work in Birmingham, England, in Edinburgh, Scotland. And there was this elderly gentleman who raised his hand after my talk and said, I need to talk to you. I said, okay, fine. That was really great. And there were several people who were talking to me, and I made my way to talk to him. And he said, I couldn't yell back and tell you how excited I was to hear about your work, because you see, I work for Scotland Yard. And I've been basically tapping the ground and figuring out if there are dead bodies or not for at least 30 years. And I didn't know that you're actually doing the science of it. So the fact that you can tap the ground and figure out what's underneath it and tell what it might be, this wasn't new. At least wasn't new to the experts like the Scotland Yard cup that was there. So at any rate, I first should tell you why it is scientifically a difficult problem, because soil is a very, very complicated thing. I mean, I don't have to tell you what soil is, right? You guys know what soil is. You can just go and dig around. And if you look at the table that I have, in table 1 here, you see that the soil particles can range in size from 2 millimeters to less than 2 micrometers. So that's like 1,000-fold difference in diameters or size. So when you get to these finer particles, that's when you get the kind of soil you have in parts of New York, which is clay. I live in the Buffalo area. It's all clay here, I can tell you. You've got to buy compost to be able to put some plants down. Otherwise, it's all clay. A little larger, and you get silt. This is what you get in Mississippi, right? And then you get fine sand, and then you get coarse sand. This fine sand is really fine, by the way. It can be finer than what they're saying, because this is the sand that blows all the way over the Atlantic to Florida and the Americas and the Caribbeans. So if you go to Caribbeans and Florida, you see a lot of Sahara sand, believe it or not. That's how mobile sand is. That's how complex it is. I can show you some pictures of that. I don't have them today, but I have them in my computer. Anyway, the point is, when you bury something in the soil, forget about water, then there's water, right? So you have these fine particles and water. You have this really messy system, and you put an object below, and you try to figure out if that object is there. It turns out it's an incredibly difficult problem. So as scientists, you want to develop a way to find these landmines or find the buried objects, because it could be useful, let's say, for archaeology, for finding drug tunnels and what have you. It has a lot of different uses. And there are 3 or 4 different kinds of lines of attack you can make. One is you can take an electromagnetic sensor. So you can take like a metal detector, in other words. You can buy a metal detector on Amazon if you want, right? It's not that expensive. It's like 30, 40 bucks, I think. A cheap one, anyway. So kids have metal detectors. I didn't know that, but it was a learning lesson for me. Anyway, so metal detectors are not that hard to buy. These metal detectors can actually detect that tiny little metal fuse that I talked about in these mines. So that's a way. It gives you a lot of false positives, though, because the soil is not pristine. The soil may have a tiny piece of nail out there that's also going to beep just as loud as your fuse would. But you want to know which one is the nail, which one is the Coke can, and which one is the fuse, right? So that's where metal detectors run aground. But they are good for finding metals, and then you dig out and see what's there. Of course, you got to know what you're doing when you're digging, because things can explode, in which case that's not going to be fun. Acoustic, which is what I've been talking about, and there is biological sensing too. So biological sensing, I want to tell you a little bit. Well, let me first tell you electromagnetic, and then we'll come to biological. The electromagnetic sensing is very powerful. People use it all the time, even now, excepting it has a reliability problem. Now, the science of it, I'll tell you in a few words. So here, for example, I've tried to make a cartoon of soil, and I've also tried to make a cartoon of a landmine, small landmine, and I've drawn some waves. So electromagnetic waves that penetrate well through soil, shallow soil, are typically large wavelength electromagnetic waves. So for example, the kind of stuff that is produced inside your microwave is a large wavelength electromagnetic wave. All right. Now, in COVID times, let's say you have your favorite pencil or pen or whatever, and you want to make sure it's sterilized. You don't put it in the microwave. It's going to melt. What you do is you put it under an under an ultraviolet light. That's what you do. And you can again buy them on Amazon. They're a little bit more expensive, but you can buy them for like $100 on Amazon. So if you place it under ultraviolet light is very, very short wavelength light. And that short wavelength light is short enough that the coronavirus particles on this will actually get deactivated. So that kind of ultraviolet can be used to clean things up, okay? It turns out that if you are trying to find mines, you have to use longer wavelength because the smaller ultraviolet range is going to get absorbed by the sand. And if it gets absorbed by the sand, it won't be able to go in. The sand's going to eat it up and get heated. That doesn't help anyone. So you want long wavelength waves to go in if you want electromagnetic waves of detection. The problem with that is long wavelength also means you get a very blurry image because the wavelength is long compared to the object size, which means that it won't be able to make a sharp image. So therefore, long wavelength detection has its problems. By the way, I should point out that most landmines are buried less than 6 inches from the ground surface. So the problem is we can't find these things which are in shallow soil. We have no trouble at all if you want to find oil 5 miles below the surface of the earth. We can do it very well because that's where long wavelength goes in very well. So we can do large depth sensing. We can't do shallow depth detection.
So there is a question. Somebody is asking if,
yeah, please.
You'll be making these slides available to them or not.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. So biological sensors, it sounds like it's a big set of words, but there are 2 kinds of biological sensors that have proven to be more or less effective. The best ones are the dogs. So the dog's nose is the most sensitive detector that we have, okay? So just to give you a sense of how good it is, in the last 25 or so years, US has spent of the order of 30-40 million to support research at MIT, which wanted to make an artificial dog's nose. They did make something, but it's nowhere close to what a dog's nose is. So that's how powerful a dog's nose is. So dogs are very good in sniffing out explosives. That's what they do. And they're also not that expensive as you would think. Now you may think that why would dogs be expensive at all? Well, that's because the dog has to be trained. And not only has the dog to be trained, as you can see in this picture, the dog's trainer also has to be trained. So the total cost, typically the total cost associated with training a dog and a human being who acts as the dog's trainer is about $20,000 or so per year. So dogs have a price tag which is not very small, and therefore many countries, especially the poor countries like Angola and Afghanistan and so on, they can't necessarily afford to have dogs do the detection. Plus dogs also have their cycles of operation. If they're overused, they start messing up, and you don't want that to happen either. In Montana, they tried bees, and apparently bees were also pretty effective. And I haven't kept track of bees lately, but it hasn't certainly been as effective as the dogs. And these bees are also genetically modified bees, so there is an upfront cost to training these bees to sniff them out, to sniff out the mines, the explosives in the mines. Now I talk about the cheap stuff, which is what I like, which is sound waves. we can all make noise. Making noise is not very difficult, right? So if you make noise at low frequency, like 150 to 300 hertz, what does 150 to 300 hertz mean? Well, that's like my voice. So if I make the right kind of noise and keep on making that noise such that the ground starts to vibrate, then whatever is buried underneath will have its reflection show up on the ground surface. And that's what you see in these pictures, basically. Excepting in this case, the vibration is quite large. This is a very expensive way of taking a picture of landmines, by the way. It works, but it's a very expensive way. And this particular way has been developing for about 50 years. So you can see the first works on this were done in 1955 by these people at University of Texas. And then the next major breakthrough came in 1973. And then there was a ton of money that was spent to support the works of these BBN Technologies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a very prestigious science and technology research firm. And they developed a whole set of reports tying together a lot of studies. And then Jim Sabatier from the University of Mississippi and a bunch of other people, they actually were the kind of people who were taking photographs like these that you see. I didn't want to quite do what Sabatier was doing. In fact, I got started on my own right, and we figured that we could actually thump the surface. And then I found that somebody else was thumping the surface down in Australia. And that was this group, Andy Rogers and Charlie Don from Monash University in Australia. And they had published their work in 1994. That is, you can see here that they were thumping the ground with speakers, like sound bursts they would send in. And then they would hear the reflections back with very sensitive microphones. And if there was nothing, they would get noise. And if there was something, they would get some reflection back. And so that they could use it as a preliminary detector. After that, there was this group from Battelle Research in Washington State. And they managed to show that Rogers and Don work could be improved, and one could probably make some rough images. And this is some work we did in Buffalo, actually, the colored work that you see. I'm going to skip that because it's a little complicated. But I'll tell you, I'll jump ahead a little bit and come back to these slides. I'll tell you what we did. So what we did was we basically took a sand bed. This is not really the minefield at all. We put a landmine roughly underneath this yellow metal disc. And then we dropped this metal ball from the top. And this metal ball fell on this disc and distributed the pressure, the momentary pressure, which we would call an impulse, to the ground below. And you heard a reflection back, as you can see in the figure below, if there was a buried object, which is the blue line here, and no reflection that was of much interest if you didn't have a buried object. So clearly what Rogers and Don were saying, what House and Pape were saying, we could certainly get that. That was not a big deal. And that's exactly what I had thought of in 1994. These were done 7 years later in 2001. And we wrote a paper on that. We wrote a paper on other works also. But then I thought, if we could do this, we could actually make a very good image of what's underneath. And I'll very briefly tell you why that works, because the science of that is kind of interesting. The science of that goes back to how two sand grains, they talk to each other. So if you take two tiny sand grains and press against each other, they're pretty hard. They're quartz, okay? They're basically quartz particles, silica. And what happens is that as you press them against each other, they develop repulsive forces. And this repulsive force is a very sharp repulsive force. It's not like a soft repulsive force. They hate each other. They kind of want to get away from each other. So what's the big deal about that? Well, two things. First of all, this repulsive force was calculated by a 21-year-old scientist back in 1881. And you probably know his name. His name was Heinrich Hertz, the same megahertz, gigahertz, kilohertz guy. All your cell phones have gigahertz, right? So you know who Hertz was. So he figured it out, and we are the mere followers of Hertz's law. And then in 1983, more than 100 years later, this Siberian scientist, Vitaly Nesterenko, who's now at San Diego, by the way, he left Siberia, did an amazingly simple experiment. The simple experiment was, he took a column, this is a horizontal column, and he put some steel balls, like ball bearings, if you will. Made sure they're touching each other. So these are like sand particles, excepting they look much nicer than irregular sand particles, but have the same properties roughly. And then there is a pressure gauge here, and he hit the other end of this alignment of spheres with a striker, just like that. And it turns out, he discovered that if he did that, then the striker pulse traveled to the pressure gauge almost undestroyed as a pulse, just the way it was actually imparted onto this chain. So if you could measure the force that the striker would generate on the first ball, it would be maybe a force as a function of time. Force goes up and then slowly comes down. And he found that in the pressure gauge, that last ball basically gave the exact same pressure pulse to the pressure gauge. That's not what happens normally. So that's a big deal. And he called this a solitary wave. And for reasons that I won't get into, I can answer questions later on. The long and short of it is that because of this property, the thumping works. So if you have the soil surface and if you press it, because of this property, the pressure goes down to whatever is below without much modification. So the science of this goes back to Heinrich Hertz and to my friend Vitaly Nesterenko. So what I was thinking actually was accidentally right. This doesn't happen very often. Most of the times when I think of things, I turn out to be wrong. This was not one of those times. I will skip this slide because this has some interesting science, which is part of the reason why Nathaniel, the current PhD student, is working on it. We are actually able to now predict which sound frequencies will go better in which kinds of soil. That's the work we are finishing up after 26 years. What it is that depending upon the impulse, you can generate a single impulse or generate a series of impulses. And when you generate a series of impulses, it interacts with other vibrations to give you frequencies. And those frequencies determine which frequencies actually propagate through soil. I don't expect you to get it, but Nathaniel also doesn't get it. He fights with me half the time saying that you must be wrong, but I know I'm right. And I can tell you later why I'm right. All right, so long and short of it is this. Long and short of it is we can actually image what's buried in there. How cool is that? So basically you can thumb the ground and do exactly what the Scotland Yard guy said. You can image what's buried in there. You can see the shape, and you don't expect a landmine to have a weird shape. Landmines have certain regular shapes. They are circular when looked at from the top. Even if they're at an angle, they are not going to be, a silly random shape. It's going to be like an ellipse or something. So the fact is that as long as you can see a regular shape in there, that's better than looking at a nail or looking at many other things. You may not be able to distinguish, by the way, between a Coke bottle or a Coke can or a beer can and a landmine. That may be a problem. But I tell you what, not too many people in those landmine infested areas are drinking Coke and beer. So you don't have a big problem, okay? Mm-hmm. All right, so now let me skip this because this gets into detail that I don't necessarily feel are very important. There are other technologies. So I told you about metal detectors, right? I told you about dogs. I told you about acoustic sensing, which is what one of the things I am looking at. And among the cheaper ones would be the acoustic sensing. Right now, landmine clearing is by and large done in all the 80 or so countries, however many countries, manually, all right? So people actually go, they dig the soil, they kind of dig the soil with their fingers, and they essentially try to scope it out. And then if they have metal detectors, they try use them. If they have dogs around, trained dogs, they try and use them. But ultimately, the whole idea of getting the landmine out without exploding has to be done manually. Now you can say, why not let it explode? Well, the problem is if you let it explode, it contaminates the soil with explosives. And once that happens, that soil becomes not useful for a long time. So therefore, it is not seen as a good idea to let the landmines explode, because that would make the soil worse. And by making the soil worse, it doesn't really help anybody. This is the dog, and this is the dog nose. This is, by the way, a 2019 article from a 2019 article that appeared in MIT Technology Review. I don't have access to it, so I had to ask one of my former students who is at MIT to get this beautiful picture to me. As you can see, the Labrador doesn't like its nose, or doesn't like its competitor's nose very much, but it has every reason not to like it, because the Labrador does a far better job than that white artificial nose that you see on the right side. So to summarize, landmine detection has remained a really, really difficult, nasty problem. Think about it. We have gone to the moon in 1960s, right? We have gone to Mars, right? We have actually taken selfies on an asteroid, right? We have gone to the moons of Jupiter. We have checked out Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto. We have actually traveled outside the solar system into interstellar space. There are two spacecrafts in interstellar space now, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, right? And we cannot find a damn landmine 6 inches under our feet. Just imagine how stupid that is. Just imagine. So with that thought, let me just tell you why we can't do this. We can't do this because America doesn't have landmines in our backyard. That's the problem. That's a very cynical way of ending this talk. But if we had landmines in our backyard, I can assure you we would have found it. We really have no great urge to find it because it's not in our backyard. We do what we can, but we don't do humanitarian demining in this country. And I hope someday we do, which is why the problem sadly hasn't been solved. But it's a fantastic problem. It's a problem that brings in kind of all the science that one can think of together. And for that reason, I thought that I'll tell you guys this story. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So that was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And at a level which I think they can easily follow. I have a few questions.
Yes, please.
One is, Princess Diana, she, championed this cause.
Yes.
At that time, we used to hear a lot more about landmines and how many people are dying and
yes.
Getting hurt and so on, particularly in Africa. But today, we hardly ever hear anything about landmines. So I have several part question. Number one, I mean, in Afghanistan, are they using landmines there in Afghanistan right now?
So a couple of quick comments. One is that, so there is something called the International Treaty. This international treaty was signed around 99 or so. And the treaty basically was a referendum that countries that involve themselves in various wars, in whichever side, that they would not use landmines as a weapon of war. While many countries were signatories to it, which which helped a lot. US was not, which is sad because US was the country that took the leadership in pulling this coalition together of countries to get this treaty done. President Clinton at the time, he refrained from signing it. And the reason is quite straightforward. The reason remains active even today. The reason is that US is an active user of smart landmines, which are self-deactivating landmines in the North and South Korea border, which is this demilitarized zone. That was the reason why. US doesn't use landmines as such in most other wars, from what I understand. Anyway, this information would probably be classified anyway, so I wouldn't know. But I would venture to guess that in Afghanistan, US probably doesn't use landmines, but that doesn't mean landmines aren't there, because we all hear about landmine injuries, right? There are so many people, so many soldiers that have gotten injured in landmines. So yeah, they're there. Afghanistan, by the way, had a very, very active demining force, and I have met people from that force. Actually, I used to know the person who ran the force, because he had come to that conference in Edinburgh. And at the time, which was 98, they did a lot of manual clearance. And they lost some people every year, but that was the only way they did it. This is prior to the war, Iraq war and all that. So right now, I'd imagine things may be quite a bit worse. But coming back to Princess Diana, it was a great help to have her be active as a. In fact, I got involved around the time when Diana was also getting involved. So the fact when she came aboard, it helped in terms of visibility. And the UN was becoming quite serious because it wanted to let everybody know that it was doing what it could. And they had assigned a senior brigadier from Britain to take care of it, Paddy Blagden. But I think with Diana's passing, things kind of have decayed. Queen Noor did take up the cause, but I don't think she was that effective later after her husband passed away. King Hussein's death, after King Hussein's death. So there's a lot of political, pressure that is needed. And right now, the world politics has not really been very good. So I think ever since US got involved in the Iraq war, this topic has not been emphasized.
The reason I ask you this question is because the design of a landmine is pretty simple.
Yes.
So even terrorists can make these mines.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if, ISIS and Taliban's.
Yeah, most definitely. They use it. It's very easy to make. You just take a plastic container, you put in some explosives, you put in a fuse, you adjust the pressures, and that's it. Yeah. Probably take 30 cents to make it.
Now, talking of the pressure, it has to be very close to the surface. So what is the average distance, 6 inch or even less than 6 inch?
Usually less.
It should be less, okay.
Usually less, yeah. Sometimes the older mines, like the World War I mines or World War II mines, they may have sunk. So they are a bit harder to find. But most of the mines that are in relatively active or regions that were active within the past decade or so, they're within 3-4 inches. So very, very close to the soil surface.
And are you performing experiments these days on these devices that you are talking about?
No, we were doing some. One of my colleagues, he and I were doing it. He left Buffalo for Boston College, and after that work kind of didn't get very far. And it turns out the Department of Defense spends very little money on this. So Department of Defense spends money really treating humanitarian demining as a side project because it is tied to army demining, which is for the soldiers. But army demining and humanitarian demining are very different, which is why I stopped going to them for money, because US Army has a lot of money, okay? To them, $2 billion is nothing. That's chump change. So US Army doesn't care if the technology that is being deployed for mine clearance is inexpensive or expensive, because from a US standpoint, it's not an issue. So the technology development in the US end has been focused on very expensive technologies. Like one of them I didn't talk about is nuclear quadrupolar resonance, NQR methods. So quadrupolar resonance has been used. That's a very expensive method, but Lawrence Berkeley Labs pioneered that, and it works very well. But not too many countries can afford an NQR apparatus, right? Let alone figuring out how to operate that in large fields. So that's the problem. So at this point, the technology development, as far as I know, has literally been standstill for about 15 years now, which is really sad. Inexpensive technology development. Because there's no money to be made. You see, the way we talk about science and we talk about research, the way we develop policy is that we support things with the understanding that the private sector will pick it up. There is no private sector here. We are talking about people's lives, right? So that it doesn't fit the model. And that's the problem. That's always been the problem.